today we are going to be finishing up with our taxonomy. So just, we've gone through now all of our groups except for one last group here. So remind me, in terms of overall taxonomic classification, what domain are we in right now? What domain? That's not a domain. Eukarya is the domain that included all animals, all plants, all fungi, all protists. Okay, so we're in the domain Eukarya. What kingdom? Animalia, or animals. Yes. Does anyone remember the phylum? So we're now going to be talking about vertebrates. And I did tell you once a while back the name of the phylum of vertebrates. No, not quite. But you're on the right track, Mitchell.
Chordata.
Chordata. Chordates. They have a spinal cord and a backbone. So if you think back to invertebrates, each invertebrate that we talked about different phyla of invertebrates. Cnidarians and echinoderms and mollusks and arthropods and so forth. When we're talking about the vertebrates, however, they're all together in one phylum called chordates, or chordata. And so some of the characteristics of the chordates are that they have an internal skeleton. None of the organisms we talked about so far have an internal skeleton of bone. They all had, some of them had a skeleton on the outside, like arthropods. What do we call that? Exoskeleton. Some of them had no real skeleton. But the vertebrates do have a skeleton. It's called an endo. That means inside skeleton. They have bones. What exactly are vertebrae? Where does that come from? Vertebrae. Layla? Yeah, they are the small, sort of roundish segments of bone that make up our backbone. They're a vertebral column. And those bones are our backbone. Their purpose is to protect what? What's inside of those vertebrae? No, they're attached to the outside. What? What is your spine? Well, we call sometimes the bones your spine. The spinal what? There are spinal fluid, but also the spinal cord. The spinal cord, I have a model and I don't see it right now. So the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is a series, is a bundle of nerve tissue that conducts messages from the brain down to other parts of the body. So if we look at the back of our friend here. All right, so if we look, this is a human model of a skeleton. It's not real. Each of these bones here that I'm touching, each one is a single vertebrae. Okay? They're stacked one on top of each other. They have a little disc of cartilage between them. And running through the middle is the spinal cord, a bundle of nerve tissue that brings the messages from our brain down, and then coming out from our spinal cord are nerves that go to all the other parts of our body. So they bring information from other parts of our body up to our brain, and from our brain down to the other parts of our body. So that's our backbone. Those are our vertebrae. Danielle?
Is that why, like, for example, like, you can break your back? Is that why, like, you can be, like, paralyzed?
Yeah, so breaking your back, breaking these bones can happen, but that doesn't cause paralysis. Breaking what causes paralysis? Nope, not bone. Yes, a break in the actual tissue that's inside of here, the spinal cord itself. That's what can cause paralysis. And so it's not the actual bones themselves. You know, sometimes people do fracture vertebrae. They can be cracked or broken. That's not what causes paralysis. It's when the underlying spinal cord gets damaged. And that should make sense because if a person has, let's say they have a break in their spinal cord, I'll show you this down here somewhere, okay? And their brain is still sending the message to their legs to move. And the message travels down the spinal cord, but it gets to a point where it reaches the damage and it can't go any further. So the message telling their leg muscles to move can't get there because it's being blocked by this damage. At the same time, they have a person that has a spinal cord trauma like that can't feel anything from their lower extremities. Again, because if you touch that leg, the message, the impulse comes up, but it gets to that break in the spinal cord and it can't make its way to the brain. So the information, the sensory information, is not getting the brain, and that's where we actually have those sensations. So it's basically like a roadblock where messages can't get from the brain to the other parts of the body. The higher up the damage is, the more loss of function there is. A high damage to the spinal cord, like in the neck, could cause paralysis of both arms and legs. Okay? So where that damage happens is important to the injury. So doctors do not currently have a way of repairing a spinal cord, a full break in the spinal cord. It's not like bone that will just heal back together on its own. It's not like muscle tissue that can be stitched back together and heal. Thus far, scientists don't have a way to help to go past that. There's lots of things they're working on. Sometimes they're working on ways of implanting electrical sensors in the brain, which then sort of send that message directly to electrical sensors that are lower down in the body, past the brain, or ways of using stem cells to help nerve tissue heal. So there's lots of possibilities, but none that work currently. Stem cells are a special type of cell that we all had and we all started as a newly fertilized zygote and embryo. All of our cells, we start off as just a ball of cells. They're all identical to each other. They're sort of generic cells. As the embryo starts to grow larger and starts to take on more functions, the cells start to what we call differentiate. Some become great nerve cells, some become blood cells, some become skeletal cells. And so those original cells have the ability to turn into any other cell of the body. And so those are called stem cells. So the stem cells you are referring to are embryonic stem cells that come from the embryo. Scientists now have ways of taking other body cells, changing them into stem cells, and then using those stem cells to create other types of tissue. So that's not something that they've been able to do for all that long. You know, it's something that happened last decade or so. And so because stem cells can grow into any other type of tissue, there's lots of ways they can be used in treating different illnesses and different types of damage to different parts of the body.
So,
not now. Yeah, but in the future, could they? Possibly. They've grown like from stem cells like ears, because ears are mostly cartilage. You could grow like an ear. You can grow heart tissue and like a mesh shaped like a heart. So they're getting closer and closer to be able to do like that, but not complex organs, not like an arm or a hand or something like that. Mostly just tissues. All right, so anyway, all that was about this. These are the vertebrae. These are the bones we're talking about. Vertebrates have these bones in their back. So there are 5 classes of vertebrates, like you guys explained to me at the beginning of class. What's this?
Fish, frog, dog.
All right, yep. So fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Now, this is simplifying things a little bit. We're not going to get into complexity. There are some other things, but we're just going to talk about these 5 groups overall. And so these 5 groups have certain things in common. Animals, so they have all the characteristics of animals, but they also have this internal skeleton. They have complex organs and organ systems. And we're going to talk about them in general. Now, we'll talk about, and I'll explain some things. There's not much for you to write here, but I'll just talk a little bit about some of these. So the vertebrates have lots of adaptations that they've evolved over a period of time. The first vertebrates to evolve were types of fish. Fish were the first vertebrates. And this is on the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about where things went from there. So vertebrates have body systems, and one adaptation that they have that allows them to function in different environments is their body temperature. Some vertebrates are able to control their body temperature internally. Others cannot. What are the terms we use for those? Warm and cold-blooded. Now, they're not really great terms. There's actually other terms we use, ectotherms and endotherms, but these are sort of the common words. So a cold-blooded organism, tell me about them. What do you know about cold-blooded animals? Give me something, yeah.
They have to use the climate to change their temperature.
Yeah, they can't regulate their body temperature internally. Whatever the temperature of their surroundings, that's the temperature that their body is. They don't have internal control. So what does that mean? It means that, well, first, what are examples of cold-blooded vertebrates? Give me one, Sophia. Reptiles are cold-blooded. The other groups? Amphibians are cold-blooded. No? Why? Fish. So fish, amphibians, and reptiles are the cold-blooded vertebrates. So right now, you see it snowing outside. Are any vertebrates alive out in the courtyard?
Yeah.
Okay. Some are. Any cold-blooded invertebrates alive out there?
Yeah.
So there could be.
Yeah, in the ground.
There could be. There could be some snakes there out there. And there could be some frogs, probably no fish. There could be some other organisms out there that are cold-blooded. There's certainly lots of insects and stuff, but we're talking about vertebrates. What happens to those cold-blooded organisms in the winter? Well, they don't freeze solid typically. That would be damaging to their tissue. But why don't we see them? What's going on with them, Layla? Yes. So because they're cold-blooded, when their body temperature drops down to 30 degrees like it is today, they cannot be active. That's too low of body temperature. Now, they're still alive. They're not moving around. Many of them will hibernate. They'll dig into the ground or go in the mud or find a burrow, and they'll just basically wait out the cold months because they can't be active under those low temperatures. But as spring comes and temperatures warm up, what happens? Their body temperature rises, and eventually, what do? Yeah, they can be more active, and they can come out, find food, and so forth. So you've seen cold-blooded animals probably. If you ever see reptiles, for example, often sun themselves, like these turtles. If you were kayaking or something on a river, you may see some turtles on the rocks, on a log, just standing there in the sun. What they're doing is they're trying to raise their body. They can't do it internally, but they can go into a sunny place, absorb sunlight to warm up their bodies until they can be active. What do they do if it gets too hot? Go into a burrow, go in the water, go in the shade, go somewhere else. So often you'll see these cold-blooded vertebrates trying to regulate their body temperature, but they do it by where they go. some of their behaviors, not by internal means. Warm-blooded animals, however, let me finish this. They have internal means of regulating their body temperature. So this penguin's body temperature, whatever it may be, it's not going to change based on how cold it is outside. The squirrels outside of the courtyard, they have the same body temperature today that they did in the middle of July. They maintain homeostasis of their body temperature using internal means. Okay, so birds and mammals are the warm-blooded vertebrates. Now, what's an advantage to being cold-blooded? It would seem like, well, that doesn't really make much sense. When it's cold, you can't really move at all. Okay, you can't control your body temperature. You just depend on the environment, but there is an advantage. Jake? Yeah, it's efficient. It doesn't require a lot of energy. If you ever had a pet of a reptile or something, sometimes you have pets, you know, you don't have to feed them that much. They can survive for a long period of time without eating a lot because they're not using up lots of energy keeping a high body temperature. You know, those fish can go weeks without eating in that tank. Snakes can go weeks without eating a prey because they're not using lots of energy. What's the downside of being cold-blooded? The negative part. Olympia? Okay. Let me get this answer first then. Maddie?
You have to like keep moving.
Yeah, you have to find ways of regulating your body temperature. You can't be active in cold conditions. Can warm-blooded animals be active in cold conditions? Yeah. Take the penguin or a polar bear. There's lots of warm-blooded animals that they can be active even if it's very, very cold out. We have deer every night in our yard walking around even though it's 30 degrees or 20 degrees out. So they're generating their own body heat, and that allows them to be active even if it's cold. But what's the negative side of being warm-blooded? Got it? No, not really. It takes a lot of energy. Warm-blooded animals have to eat a lot, and they have to eat constantly. Obviously, if you have a pet that's warm-blooded, like a dog, you have to feed it every single day. They're using up lots of energy maintaining a high body temperature. All right. But they can be active in a wide variety of climates. Olivia, what was your question?
How would they survive
For the cold-blooded? Because their body processes are so slow that they're not using. They stored up energy over the spring and summer, and they subsist on that over the winter. Go ahead, John.
Do you think a whale would be one because they go so deep that far just freezing?
Yeah, whales are warm-blooded. All mammals, because whales are mammals. All mammals are warm-blooded. All right. Yes.
Since cold-blooded animals hibernate, why do warm-blooded?
Sometimes they do it because of a lack of food, not so much because it's too cold. Like some warm-blooded animals hibernate because there's just very little food, so they go into a state where they're sort of dormant and not using as much energy, so that because there's not a lot of food available. Yeah, we usually are just talking about vertebrates. We weren't talking about this, but yeah, they don't control their body temperature. All right, let's talk about body coverings. This is another characteristic of vertebrates that distinguishes them. So some vertebrates are covered in scales, some are covered in skin, some are covered in feathers, some are covered in fur. So scales. Which vertebrates are covered in scales? And fish. Fish and reptiles. Now, scales and reptiles are really important. What makes a reptile different from an amphibian? Which? Kind of, you're on the right track, but you kind of got to reverse mine. So amphibians go in water and land as well. Next.
Amphibians need water to survive.
And
reptiles don't.
right, reptiles evolved to be able to live out of the water permanently. All amphibians need to return to the water at least for what purpose?
Cool down.
Nope.
Homestead.
Babies.
To reproduce.
That's what I was saying.
Yes. Amphibians must be in the water in order to reproduce. Reptiles do not. Reptiles evolved to be able to live in even very dry conditions. Because one of the reasons they could is because of their scales. What is the purpose of those scales in terms of living out of the water? Yeah, it's waterproof covering so that they don't dry out in the heat and hot conditions in the sun, whereas amphibians, they could dry out. So scales are one adaptation to living outside of the water. Amphibians have just a very thin skin as their outer covering typically. And that outer covering is helpful in some ways because many amphibians actually absorb oxygen through that very thin skin, helping them to get oxygen even in the water. However, they can lose water pretty easily because they have that thin skin. It's not waterproof, so they can dry out relatively easily.
So why do fish have scales?
Yeah, fish have scales, but they're sort of a different purpose. They're more of a protective scale. Okay. Also, they secrete a mucus, helping them swim through the water.
Makes it fish like really sick easily because they absorb so much stuff with their skin.
No, I don't think so, because it's semi-permeable, so it doesn't absorb everything. Feathers. Feathers have multiple purposes. Some feathers are obviously, these are called flight feathers that are in the wings. They allow birds to fly. But they're also insulating feathers. Do you know what they're called?
Oh, I just found.
Yeah, down feathers. Like if you have a down jacket or a down comforter on your bed or a down pillow, that's just filled with tiny little feathers. Sometimes they come out and poke you.
Yeah.
And those feathers are from a goose, and they help insulate. All birds have those feathers close to their body, and they help trap heat. That's why they're used in pillows and blankets, because they can trap heat. What is it? They trap heat close to the organ. Trap heat close to the organ. Yeah, sorry. So they have multiple purposes, feathers. And then we have fur. Mammals are the only group that has fur. And fur also provides insulation to the animal in a way similar to those down feathers in birds.
Wait, if mammals have fur, then why don't
We do have fur. We have
fur?
we have
Make it move.
we have adapted to have less fur than other mammal species, but we still have some
That's
fur.
good.
Some of us more than others, some
No.
less.
Wait, but when it says up there, skin allows gas exchange, I still don't get it.
So the skin of amphibians is very thin. And so what, not us, no, amphibians.
Oh, we're fur.
Yes. And so that skin allows oxygen to come through it, and they can absorb it directly. Question, Sage. I don't know. It depends, because our hair that we currently have, so we have sort of short-circuited evolution a little bit because we wear clothes, we have jackets, so our fur that we have is not really providing us for warmth. So having thicker fur or less thick fur isn't really providing an advantage. However, having excessive amounts maybe of body hair may be a disadvantage in terms of reproductive success, or maybe having no hair on the head provides less reproductive success, if you understand what I mean, and therefore those genes don't get passed on as frequently. So that's an idea. All right, we have questions about fur, hair, and body coverings? Or what? What do you have a question about? What? Go ahead. I thought this already. What? Yeah, so some animals can't fly. They evolve to be so large that they're unable to. But that's sort of just a few species.
How would they evolve?
Because they are very fast, however. So, Jack, quickly.
Are penguins mammals?
Yep, no, penguins are birds. Yeah, those are feathers.
Penguins.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
It's kind of, I don't think it's animal reptile, but it's covered in scales of keratin.
Oh, well, that's probably a reptile, but I'm not familiar with them.
Oh,
Mitchell?
like they live in Asia and
Mitchell, go ahead. Penguins have feathers. Yes, they do have feathers. Those are feathers covering their body. Yep. All right, let's talk about reproduction. Another adaptation that vertebrates have evolved has to do with reproduction, both in terms of fertilization and embryonic development. So, fish, tell me about fish reproduction and fertilization. How do fish actually reproduce? Danielle?
Cells.
What do? They have eggs and sperm. All these vertebrates reproduce sexually. So they all produce sperm and egg cells. But how those egg cells actually get fertilized by sperm cells varies from vertebrate to vertebrate. Fish, for example, the female just releases eggs into the water, and at the same time, in the same location, males just release sperm into the water, and some of those sperm cells make their way to the egg and fertilize it. We call that external fertilization. The fertilization of the egg happened outside of the body. Okay? There you see some, these are not fish eggs, these are amphibian eggs. So amphibians also have external fertilization. So the female frog just lays this massive eggs in the water. The male will come and fertilize them, and then they can grow into embryos. That's external fertilization. So other mammals, so both of those fish, girls, both of those examples, fish and amphibians, where do they reproduce? In the water. So the sperm cells and egg cells need the water as a means for the sperm cells to swim and reach the egg cells to fertilize. Okay. What about reptiles, birds, and mammals? They've evolved an adaptation that allows them to fertilize eggs on land, away from the water. And the adaptation is internal fertilization. So instead of the female just releasing eggs into the water and the male fertilizing them, eggs are held inside of the female's body. The male deposits sperm cells inside of the female body, where those sperm cells swim their way to the egg to fertilize them. So that's internal fertilization. Yes, and you just thought the turtles were playing.
They go, what are you doing?
They're just hugging each other. Now we know so much more. All right, so internal fertilization is when male deposits sperm into the female's body, they fertilize the eggs there. But there's another step, because once eggs are fertilized, they have to then grow into embryos and be born, or be hatched, or develop into an actual organism. So the next question is, where do the embryos actually develop and grow? So they can either happen externally or internally. So for most vertebrates, fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, the embryo grows outside of the body in an egg. Okay. So fish eggs, for example, the embryo grows in an egg in the water. But mammals have adapted, most mammals, to have internal embryonic development. So in mammals, the embryo is fertilized inside of the female's body, but then it stays there. And it grows into an embryo, into a fetus inside of the female body until it's ready to be born. So that's an example of internal development. Now, what are the yes? So, what are the advantages and disadvantages? External development doesn't take much care from the parents, doesn't require a lot of energy, but there's low survival, right? When fish lay eggs, they get fertilized, they're just growing out in the water. Many of them are preyed upon, many of them just float away. So there's not a high survival rate. Whereas in mammals that have internal development, there's a higher rate of survival because the young, as the embryos are growing, they're being protected inside of the female. Yes, fish, amphibians, and birds and reptiles, they develop in the egg. That's external. These species evolved over time in this order. So the first vertebrates really to evolve on Earth were fish that evolved in the water. A group of fish evolved to be able to live partially on land. They became amphibians, but they still required returning to the water always for reproduction. A subgroup of amphibians then evolved into reptiles, which could spend all of their lives outside of the water. That required scales. It required a waterproof egg that can survive on land. You know, a bird egg or reptile egg is basically a tiny little bit of a watery environment for the embryo to grow in, packaged up inside that egg. Reptiles split off into two groups. One group, some stayed reptiles. Another group evolved to become birds. Birds evolved from reptiles. Also, a group of reptiles evolved into mammals. So both mammals and reptiles evolved from, no, mammals and birds evolved from reptiles. Yes. All right, let's try and finish up here. So now that we've gone over these various characteristics and adaptations, let's talk about each class and summarize. Body temperature. Which of these are cold-blooded? Yes, fish, amphibians, reptiles. Birds and mammals are warm-blooded. How about where the eggs are fertilized? Fish external, amphibians external, the rest are internal. Right, the male snake fertilizes an egg inside of the female, then the egg develops and it's right afterwards. Where do the eggs develop? All of them except, no, not in the water, but outside of the body. All of them except for, and there are even some mammals that do lay eggs. Platypus, a monotreme. Yeah. A platypus is a type of a monotreme. Also spiny antlers. Heart chambers, we didn't talk about this yet. Fish have a simple heart. It's made of just two chambers, an atrium and a ventricle. But as evolution took place, amphibians developed three-chambered hearts that's slightly more efficient at getting oxygen to the cells. Reptiles evolved sort of a half a chamber in the ventricle. In birds and mammals, we have what? Four chambers. And that allows for the most efficient transfer of oxygen to all parts of the organism. Body covering. Scales, skin, scales, feathers, and breathing. How do they get oxygen? Fish? They do. Gills. Amphibians? They have gills. Also, often when they're like, think of a tadpole, has gills in the beginning stages and lungs later in life. Also, they can absorb oxygen through their skin. How about reptiles, birds, and mammals? All lungs adapted to breathing on land. Oh, I got a story for you, but I don't have time today. It's about when I was attacked by a shark.
Wait, go back. Actually, tell us the story.
I can't. It takes like 5 minutes. Maybe Thursday.
I didn't tell
I'm not gonna be here tomorrow.
Wait, no.
We're gonna have your subs. I'm not sure who your sub's gonna be.